Shadow had an imposing presence that commanded attention from anyone he encountered, making it evident he was no ordinary canine. This realization struck the veterinarian the moment Shadow and his owner, Ethan, entered the clinic, prompting an immediate call to the authorities. While Ethan sat unaware in the waiting room, the situation escalated quickly behind the scenes. Soon, the police would confront him, leaving Ethan regretting his decision to purchase Shadow. As the reality of the situation began to dawn on him, Ethan's first reaction was to grab Shadow and flee. He couldn't fathom why the vet had summoned the police, but he feared losing his cherished pet. However, his escape plans were thwarted before he could even reach the exit. The police had swiftly arrived, blocking any chance of departure. Ethan was initially defiant, unwilling to surrender Shadow without a struggle. Yet, as the officers began to clarify the situation, everything started to make sense to Ethan, and he realized the extraordinary nature of Shadow. How could he have missed such obvious signs for so long? But the lingering question remained. Why had the vet felt compelled to involve the police? Ethan hadn't intended to adopt a dog that day, but something about Shadow captivated him instantly. Their eyes met, Shadow's piercing yellow gaze and distinct, sharp ears drawing him in, before the dog looked away. Despite a sense of intimidation, Ethan felt an inexplicable pull towards the dog. He had already decided to take Shadow home for two reasons. Firstly, he had mentally named him after the Egyptian god of the underworld, and secondly, the disinterested vendor at the farmer's market seemed to care little for the well-being of his animals. The dog had only been available since the day before, and the seller had bluntly commented on how Shadow's fierce appearance turned potential buyers away, suggesting a bleak fate at animal control if not purchased. Compelled by these circumstances, Ethan resolved to save Shadow from such an unjust end. Part of Ethan felt apprehensive that the man, appearing somewhat untrustworthy, might ask for a sum beyond his reach. Fortunately, that wasn't the situation. The vendor simply appeared desperate to be rid of the peculiar dog. Ethan sensed he ought to have a conversation with his wife, Lisa, about adopting a dog, especially one that looked so menacing, given that they had 4-year-old twins at home. He wondered how this ominous black dog would interact with the kids. As the seller started to pack up, time was running out. The thought of Shadow being sent to a shelter and possibly euthanized was unbearable for Ethan, prompting him to make a quick decision. He knew Lisa well enough to anticipate her objection to the dog if he consulted her beforehand. So, he paid the dubious seller and led the remarkably calm and obedient Shadow to his truck. Throughout the drive home, Shadow was tranquil, quietly observing the world through the window. It wasn't until they arrived home that Ethan noticed Shadow hadn't made a sound the entire trip. He wondered if the dog had received some sort of training in the past. Could Shadow have been a trained police or military dog that didn't meet the requirements? Such composure seemed extraordinary. Upon reaching home, Ethan could almost feel Lisa's glare piercing through the window as he walked up the porch with Shadow. Luckily, his sons, Jason and Jeremy, were quicker to the door than Lisa. Holding his breath and tightening his hold on the leash, Ethan braced for any sign of aggression from Shadow. Lisa rushed behind the twins, visibly scared. Despite his formidable appearance, Shadow remained undisturbed, displaying an unsettling calmness. Jason and Jeremy were thrilled, exclaiming that Shadow was the coolest dog they had ever seen. Even though the dog stayed calm, Lisa struggled to curb her anger. She was deeply upset. How could Ethan make such a unilateral decision? What was he thinking, bringing such a dog into their home without discussing it with her first? Why would he impulsively purchase a dog from a stranger at a farmer's market? After Lisa had expressed all her concerns, Ethan offered an apology for not consulting her first. He then shared the full story. Upon learning that Shadow was headed for a kill shelter before Ethan stepped in, Lisa's anger subsided somewhat. She confessed that despite her initial reservations, she had grown to like Shadow. Her main concern was the safety of their energetic and noisy twins around him. Ethan concurred that it would be wise to closely monitor the interactions between the twins and Shadow for the time being. Shadow proved to be more than just a deterrent to potential intruders. To Ethan and Lisa's relief, he quickly demonstrated that he was an exceptionally capable family dog. He was unfazed by disturbances, and his formidable presence also made him an excellent guard dog. Though Lisa and Ethan were somewhat uneasy about this, Shadow seemed completely indifferent. During walks in the park, whether it was Ethan or Lisa with him, other dog owners, joggers, and passers-by would steer clear of them, maintaining a safe distance. After living with Ethan, Lisa, and the twins for nearly a month, Shadow's stoic and imposing nature had remained unchanged. Ethan felt a growing unease about the dog's apparent lack of emotion. Nothing seemed to upset or excite him. With an appointment scheduled for 3 days later, Ethan decided to do some preliminary research on his own. Ultimately, he arranged for a vet visit to have Shadow thoroughly examined, but this routine checkup would escalate into a situation beyond Ethan's wildest expectations. He was still uncertain about the dog's breed and potential health issues. Ethan had some theories, but he hoped the vet could shed light on the true nature of Shadow. After extensive research, the twins expressed a desire to accompany Ethan and Shadow to the vet, thinking they might help keep the dog calm. However, Ethan chose to leave them at home, to avoid causing them any distress in case the vet discovered a serious issue with Shadow. Ethan was sure that even the sterile, daunting environment of the vet's office wouldn't perturb Shadow. Yet, the visit was about to become a far more alarming experience for Ethan than he ever anticipated. When Ethan arrived at the vet that afternoon, the waiting room was unusually crowded. Earlier appointments had overrun their allotted times, and there had even been an emergency earlier that day. Consequently, Ethan and Shadow found themselves waiting longer than expected, attracting many wary glances in the process. Observing other pet owners hastily placing their pets back into carriers or tightening their grips on leashes, it was evident to Ethan that his dog's formidable appearance unnerved them. This reaction was nothing new to Ethan, but it was the first time it would have direct repercussions. Before we proceed with the story, I'd like to remind you to please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is crucial for us. Thank you very much. Eventually, a staff member from the vet's office approached Ethan. She seemed embarrassed as she requested that he and Shadow wait outside, explaining that other patrons had expressed feeling unsafe. Ethan glanced at Shadow, who remained tranquil as ever, and sighed deeply, disappointed yet understanding. He knew Shadow wouldn't harm anyone without cause, but it seemed that the dog's intimidating appearance would always cause others to distrust him. The people in the waiting room avoided eye contact with Ethan as he and Shadow stepped outside to wait. Little did Ethan know, the simple act of waiting outside would lead to unforeseen events. After only a few minutes outside, a man in a lengthy coat walked by Ethan and his companion, pausing abruptly as he noticed Shadow. He inquired if the formidable black dog was Ethan's, and upon confirmation, he stooped to meet Shadow. Contrary to most who met the dog, this man showed no fear of Shadow's daunting presence. He introduced himself as the head veterinarian, who was just returning from a break and in a hurry for his next client. However, something about Shadow compelled him to stop. While he was vague about what specifically drew his attention, he offered Ethan a quicker appointment under his care if he switched from his originally scheduled veterinarian. His keen interest seemed peculiar to Ethan, but considering the chilly weather and the uncertain wait time, Ethan accepted the offer. The head vet entered the building contentedly, and Ethan was ushered in merely 10 minutes later. He could feel the disapproving glares from others in the waiting room, who clearly noticed his expedited entry, but Ethan disregarded their silent judgments. Guiding Shadow into the vet's office, he found the vet dressed as if for surgery, not just a consultation. As Ethan began detailing his concerns about Shadow, the vet was more focused on examining the dog than listening to Ethan's explanations. Mid-conversation, the vet abruptly cut Ethan off, stating he needed to address something urgently. He briskly exited through a side door, shutting it and leaving Ethan alone and confused. Ethan could hear muffled voices from behind the door but couldn't decipher the words. The brief exchange lasted a couple of minutes, and although Ethan anticipated the vet's return, it didn't happen. As time dragged on to nearly 15 minutes, Ethan's impatience mounted. Unsure of what was occurring, he tried the door handle and found it locked. His knocks escalated to pounding as he called out for assistance, but there was no response. Growing increasingly incensed and suspecting it had something to do with Shadow, Ethan's anger reached its peak and he forcefully kicked the door open. Inside the adjacent room, the vet stood calmly, seemingly unaffected by the dramatic entrance. Frustrated and anxious, Ethan demanded an explanation. The vet glanced at his watch before responding that he had alerted the police about Ethan and Shadow and they could arrive at any moment. Shocked, Ethan pressed for a reason, but the vet insisted that the police would explain better than he could. Still charged with adrenaline from breaking the door, Ethan feared the police might take Shadow away. Determined not to let that happen, he braced himself for what was to come. Ethan, closely followed by Shadow, raced toward the opposite exit of the room, attempting to escape the building swiftly. However, it was too late. The police were already stationed outside and halted his progress. They clearly intended to seize Shadow, evidenced by the presence of an animal control vehicle. Yet, Ethan was determined not to relinquish Shadow without resistance. Positioning himself protectively in front of Shadow, he shouted that they would need to confront him to take the dog. During this standoff, a police officer cautiously advanced, his hands making soothing motions. He clarified that after a detailed examination, the senior veterinarian had recognized Shadow and notified the police about the discovery. The officer unveiled that the dog Ethan had acquired from a dubious seller was not merely a typical Mexican hairless dog. Instead, Shadow was the cherished pet of a prominent religious figure in Mexico City, widely respected for his teachings on Aztec culture and spirituality. The officer continued, describing the significant cultural value of this breed in Aztec tradition. According to legend, these dogs are believed to escort souls into the afterlife, a daunting notion for any devout individual. The religious leader had utilized Shadow, actually named Zolo, to provide comfort to mourning families at funerals. Unaffected by the somber environment, Zolo would sit calmly beside the leader, symbolizing that the soul of the departed was not being summoned to the underworld. This serene nature was the result of intensive training. Unfortunately, a few months prior, Zolo had been abducted by thieves who did not share these beliefs. Believed to have been euthanized, Zolo instead somehow found his way to the suspicious seller from whom Ethan had purchased him. Ethan was utterly stunned by the officer's disclosure. Suddenly, all the mysteries surrounding Shadow clicked into place. He understood that he needed to release the dog so that Shadow could return to his original home and continue his significant role in comforting grieving families. Despite the bond he had formed, parting with Shadow was hard for Ethan. Ultimately, he let Zolo go, and the dog was reunited with his owner in Mexico. Grateful for Ethan's actions, the wealthy religious leader rewarded him generously. Later, Ethan's family adopted another dog, this time making sure it was thoroughly vetted and agreed upon by all family members. Did this story resonate with you? Would you have made the same choice as Ethan to return Shadow to his rightful owner? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Ethan occasionally reminisces about Shadow, reflecting on their brief time together. Thank you for tuning in. Catch you in the next video and have an excellent day.